Tonight, we place one small ember beside the ruins of an empire. Breathe slowly. Let the world grow quiet. Our story begins in the old land between two worlds, on the high plateau of Anatolia, at the close of the 13th century, an age of fading empires and long roads, when the greatest story of them all was just a campfire on a dark hillside. Before the Ottoman Empire became a memory, before its 600 years folded themselves away into domes and tilework and small cups of coffee, there was one night when even a minor frontier chieftain, asleep beside his fire, could feel the world beginning to change. He dreamed, the old story says, of a tree growing out of his own breast, a tree whose branches spread until they shaded the whole world. Tonight, we follow that tree from its first green shoot to its last falling leaf, slowly, gently, all the way down into sleep. Welcome back, traveler. Tonight we drift east and south to the crossroads of the old world to keep company with the longest-lived of all the great empires, a story that begins with a handful of horsemen on a ragged frontier and rises, improbably, patiently, to hold 3 continents. We will be there, at a safe and drowsy distance, for the great dramatic beats the histories remember, the tide of conquest running west. The 53 days when a 1,000-year-old city held its breath behind its walls, the golden noon when the domes of the world's most beautiful skyline rose one by one against the dusk. And then, gently, we will follow the story past all of that, into the quieter truth it keeps for the end, the long lamplit afternoon of an empire that learned, better than any other, how to grow old. There is nothing you need to do now, nothing to hold on to, and nothing to fear. This is only a story, an old and slow and mostly gentle one, and it will do for you tonight what all such stories were made to do, which is to carry a tired listener kindly down into sleep. If your eyes are already heavy, let them close. You do not need them for where we are going. The pictures will come on their own softly behind your eyes, a caravan road at dusk, a chain across dark water, a garden of tulips under a crescent moon. And if they blur and drift and dissolve into one another, that is not a failure. That is exactly the point. There is nothing in tonight's telling you will be asked to remember. Empires rise and empires fall in these old histories, and both can be watched from a great enough distance with the same calm and drowsy eye. And tonight we are very far away indeed, safe and warm in the dark, merely listening while 6 centuries turn over slowly, like pages in a book already read. Take a slow breath in now and let it go, and feel the day loosen its grip on you as it goes. Feel the weight of your body settling down into the bed, your shoulders letting go, your hands unclenching. Far away, across a great deal of dark and starlit air, a high plateau lies under a rising crescent moon, its roads worn smooth by 4,000 years of walking, and on one dark hillside at its western edge a small fire is burning, and a man beside it is dreaming of a tree. We are going to go and sit near that fire, at the very beginning, and let the whole immense story unfold slow and gentle around us. Let us begin. Begin then, not with the empire at all, but with the land that made it, the old, high, worn, soft land between the worlds. Picture, spreading away beneath a low golden dusk, the great plateau of Anatolia, a country of wide brown plains and slow rivers, of far snow-touched mountains and grasslands rolling like a sea, hung between Europe on one side and Asia on the other, the way a bridge hangs between two shores. It is one of the oldest walked-upon lands on earth. Long before our story begins, the Hittites raised their stone lions here, and the Greeks built their marble cities along its shores, and the Romans drove their long straight roads across its middle, and the Persians and the Byzantines and the Seljuk Turks each held it for a while in their turn and let it go. By the close of the 13th century, where tonight's story starts, the whole plateau lay worn smooth by empires the way a doorstep is worn smooth by feet. A land so accustomed to the rising and falling of great powers that it received each new one calmly, like weather. Let that image open wide and quiet around you now, a whole ancient country at dusk, and let everything else stay dim. There is a deep and steadying comfort in beginning with the land, and it is worth resting on before any armies come. For whatever tonight's story does, however far the tide of it rises, however slowly it ebbs, the land beneath it does not change. The same long light lies down the same valleys at evening. The same dry wind moves through the same grasses. The storks still build on the same broken columns, and the same slow rivers find the same sea. Empires, seen from the land's point of view, are a kind of weather system. They blow in, they rain their cities and their roads and their languages onto the hills, and they pass, and the land keeps everything worth keeping and quietly buries the rest. Tonight you are invited to watch 600 years from exactly that point of view, the land's view, the long view, the view from which nothing is urgent and nothing is lost. Let that patience become your patience now, as you settle a little deeper into the bed, and feel how good it is to be under no obligation to hurry anywhere at all. Now come down from that great height, slowly, like a bird descending in wide circles through the evening air, toward the western edge of the plateau, because it is at the edges of things that this story begins. Below you, as you descend, the land gathers itself into hills and ridge lines, and the hills are threaded with roads, and along the roads, in the last of the light, small strings of movement are visible, caravans, walking their patient walk toward walled towns whose lamps are just being lit. This western rim of Anatolia, in the late 1200s, was a frontier, the soft, blurred, smoky border country where two old worlds leaned against each other. To the west of it, behind sea walls and ancient names, lay what remained of the Byzantine Empire, the last living piece of Rome. To the east of it stretched the broken remnants of the Seljuk Sultanate, shattered by Mongol armies a generation before into a drowsy patchwork of little principalities. And in between, in the hills where neither old power could quite reach, lived the people our story belongs to. Rest a moment on Byzantium first, for it is one of the gentlest and saddest presences in tonight's tale, and it deserves to be seen kindly. Picture it as it was in those years, an empire that had once ruled from Gibraltar to the Euphrates, now shrunk to a scatter of coastlands and one incomparable city, Constantinople, the city of the world's desire, standing at the meeting place of two seas behind the mightiest walls ever raised by human hands. 1,000 years old and tired. Its palaces echoed, its treasury was thin, its emperors wore borrowed jewels at their coronations. And yet, at dusk, it was still the most beautiful thing in the world, the great dome of its cathedral catching the last light above the water, the lamps of 10,000 windows coming on one by one, the ships riding at anchor beneath the sea walls. The city does not know, on this quiet evening where we have paused, what the new century is bringing toward it, and we will not wake it to tell it. Let it glimmer there on its promontory, ancient and half asleep, a lamp burning low but burning still. Turn your gaze now east of the frontier, to the other worn-out world, the Seljuk one, because its quiet ruin is the soil our story sprouts from. The Seljuk Turks had come into Anatolia 2 centuries earlier, riders out of the great grass sea of Central Asia, and they had made something lovely here, a sultanate of caravan cities, of turquoise-tiled domes and carved stone gateways, of poets and dervishes and astronomers. In their capital at Konya, in these very years, the poet Rumi had only just finished his life's work, and the sound of his verses still hung in the air of the Tekke halls like incense. But the Mongol storm had broken the Sultanate's back a generation before, and now its authority faded a little more each year, like a dye washing out of cloth. In its place, all along the frontier, little principalities had budded off, beyliks, each under its own bey, its own minor lord with his own band of horsemen, his own few valleys, his own modest ambitions. Most of them would bloom for a lifetime or two and be forgotten. History is mostly made of such small, forgotten flowerings. But one of them, the smallest, some say, and the farthest out toward the edge, was not going to be forgotten at all. Before we ride toward that one small baylik, though, walk a while along the roads themselves, for the roads are the true silver threads of this whole story, and they will glint through every chapter of it. Anatolia was, above everything else, a land of passage. Across it ran the great caravan routes that stitched the Mediterranean world to Persia, to India, to the Silk country of the farthest east. And along those routes the Seljuks had built their caravanserais, great stone inns, square and strong as fortresses, spaced one day's walk apart, so that a merchant could cross the whole plateau and sleep every night of the journey behind safe gates. Picture one of them now at evening, the last caravan of the day swaying in through the carved gateway, camels kneeling in the courtyard with their bells still swinging, bales of silk and sacks of pepper stacked under the arcades, a fire lit, flatbread warming, 20 languages murmuring around one pot of rice. The empire we are traveling toward tonight would be, at its heart, exactly this: a keeper of roads, a host of crossroads, and it learned that trade the way all children learn, by growing up in the house where it was practiced. Out past the caravanserai walls, meanwhile, in the hill country where the roads gave out, lived the frontier people themselves, and it is among them, in the smoke of their camps, that the story's first ember glows. They were Turkmen, herding people mostly, tent dwellers and horse breeders who had drifted west for generations ahead of the Mongol storms, and the frontier had made them into something particular. Tough, mobile, pious in a rough-edged borderland way, gathered into loose bands around chiefs they followed for luck and generosity, rather than for any crown. The Byzantines on their side of the hills had their own such borderers, and between raid and counter-raid there was also, always, the quieter traffic of the frontier: trade, ransom, marriage, friendship, two peoples living close enough to know each other's songs. Frontiers in the history sound like hard lines. Lived in, they are more like tidal zones, wet and dry by turns, mingled twice a day. It was a smoky, shifting, unpromising world, and absolutely no one in it, not the beys, not the emperors, not the drowsing chroniclers in their far-off cities, suspected that the next 600 years belonged to it. Feel how softly a great story can begin. That is worth a slow breath of its own. Not with trumpets, with goat bells. Not in a palace, in a felt tent on a brown hillside, where a small fire is banked for the night and horses shift and sigh in the dark. History's most enormous doors swing on the smallest hinges, and they swing slowly, and almost no one hears them move. Somewhere on that frontier tonight, on the particular evening our story has chosen, a chieftain of one small band is settling down to sleep beside his fire. A man of no great territory and no great name, and the dream that is coming toward him through the dark is still an hour off, and the world is entirely at peace. Let yourself match it. Settle down as he settles, breath by breath, your own fire banked, your own borders quiet, nothing approaching you through the dark tonight except sleep. Hold the whole picture now, once, gently, from far above, the way the crescent moon holds it, for this is the world as it stands on the last evening before our story properly begins. The old city on its promontory, ancient and beautiful and tired, its lamps doubling in the dark water. The broken sultanate in the east, its tiled domes going dusty, its poets' voices still warm in the air. The rows between, with their stone ends glowing like coals spaced along a hearth. And the hill country at the edge, where the tents are pitched and the fires are low and one particular sleeper is turning toward one particular dream. Every empire this land had ever carried had risen out of just such an evening, and the land had room for one more, the longest and, in its ending, the gentlest of them all. So let the plateau lie quiet under its rising moon, and let all its worn old worlds drowse where they are, the emperor in his echoing palace, the merchants behind their barred gates, the herdsmen in their tents, the storks folded down on the broken columns. Tomorrow, in the story's time, the dream will be dreamed and the first small ember will begin, very slowly, to spread. But that is tomorrow's chapter, and nothing about it needs you awake. There is a long and gentle way still to travel tonight, and every step of it goes downhill toward rest, and there is nothing along the way that can reach you at all. Rest now. Come down now, at last, to the fire itself, the one small fire this whole immense story grows from. It burns on a dark hillside in the frontier country of Bithynia, in the northwest corner of the plateau, where the hills begin their long road down toward the Sea of Marmara, and the lights of Byzantine towns glimmer in the valleys like fallen stars. Around the fire, a camp, felt tents, tethered horses, the shapes of sleeping dogs, the smell of wood smoke and wool and crushed grass. This is the camp of a Turkmen bey named Osman, and there is, on the face of it, nothing remarkable about him at all. He is the chief of one band among dozens, the holder of a few hill valleys and grazing runs, a man whose whole domain a rider could cross between breakfast and supper. His neighbors are stronger, his prospects are ordinary, and yet it is his name, Osman, softened in Western mouths to Ottoman, that the next 600 years are going to carry, the way a river carries the name of its smallest spring. Draw near to his fire now, quietly, and settle into the warm grass at the edge of the light. The old chroniclers, writing long afterward with the whole risen empire glittering around them, loved to tell of the dream. It came to Osman, they said, one night when he was a guest in the house of a holy man, a dervish sheikh named Edebali, whose lodge stood in those same frontier hills. Osman slept, and in his sleep he saw a moon rise from the breast of the old sheikh and sink down into his own, and from his own breast, where the moon had entered, a tree began to grow. It grew as dreams grow things, swiftly and slowly at once, its trunk climbing to fill the sky, its branches spreading out and out until their shade covered the whole turning world. Under those branches he saw mountains, the Caucasus, the Atlas, the Taurus, and from the roots of the mountains ran the 4 great rivers of the world, and on the rivers there were ships. And in the valleys there were harvests, and cities lifted their domes and towers into the leaves, and everywhere, over all of it, lay the trees one deep green piece. Then a wind rose, and every leaf of the tree turned like a small sword toward the city at the meeting of 2 seas, and Osman woke. In the morning, the story says, he told the dream to Edebali, and the old sheikh was silent for a while, and then said, "Sovereignty has been given to you and to your line, and my daughter shall be your wife." And so it was, says the story, smoothing 6 centuries into a single blessing. You may hold the tale as lightly as you like, historians certainly do. It was written down generations later, an empire explaining its own miracle to itself. But held lightly, at the edge of sleep, it is exactly the right shape of story, a gift arriving at night, in the borrowed bed of a guest, to a man who had done nothing yet but be generous and keep his small camp in order. All the great things in it are still folded up and harmless. The mountains are leaves, the empire is a shadow on the grass, the terrible and beautiful city is only the direction the wind blows. That is how the future always visits the present, when it visits kindly, as an image in the dark, asking nothing yet. Let the dream tree stand in your own drifting mind a moment, its shade the temperature of a summer evening, and ask nothing of it either. Who were they really, though, Osman and his people, on the plain unglamorous mornings after such dreams? The historians, squinting back through the legends, make out something like this. A small, tough, open-handed frontier company, part herdsmen and part raiders, gathered around a chief whose authority was personal, not royal, a matter of shared bread, shared luck, and fair division of spoils. They were Muslims on a Christian border, and the old word for what their warriors did was Gaza, holy border warfare, but the frontier, as ever, was blurrier and more human than the word. Greek villagers sometimes preferred Osman's light hand and low taxes to their own empire's distant ones. Byzantine border lords sometimes rode with him. One, a man remembered as Kosmahel, became his lifelong companion and his line one of the empire's great families. Renegades, refugees, dervishes, landless younger sons, herders wanting pasture, peasants wanting quiet, the little Beylik took them all and made no very searching inquiries. That was its first secret, learned before it was anything at all, that a state which lets people in grows faster than a state which keeps people out. Its second secret was patience, and patience is a lovely thing to fall asleep against. Osman's wars, such as they were not campaigns but seasons, a slow generation-long tightening around the Byzantine towns of the valley country. He did not storm cities, he could not, he had no engines and no fleet, only horsemen. Instead, he sat outside walls, sometimes for years, the way winter sits outside a house, patient, pastoral, grazing his flocks in the abandoned fields, taxing the roads, letting the town's own hunger and the empire's own neglect do the slow work. The chronicles give him one small fortress after another, taken as much by waiting as by war. There is a gentleness in that, seen from far enough away, and we are far away indeed. No assault to witness, only lamps inside a wall growing fewer over the years, and campfires outside it growing more, until one morning, almost without an event, the gates simply stood open and the tax collector had a new master. History moving at the speed of weather, conquest you could sleep through. Most people who lived it slept through most of it. Let your breathing slow another degree, and stay in that wide, drowsy patience a while, because the story keeps a lovely image in it. Osman, grown old, dying in his hill camp, the chronicles said it around the year 1326, while down in the valley his son Orhan was at last receiving the surrender of Bursa, the first real city, silk market of the region, green under its mountain. The old bey never entered it, or entered it only to be buried. They laid him, the story says, in a silver-domed tomb in the city he had circled for a decade and never forced. And his testament to his son, as the tradition polished it, was all mildness. Be just, protect the people, take counsel, and keep the road open for the traveler. Empires do not usually begin so quietly that their founder's monument is a tomb in a town taken by patience. Hold that silver dome in the dusk a moment, the first dome of the story's 1,000, and let it glow there, small and calm, like the first lamp lit in a house at evening. Under the new young bey, the small state began, very gently, to become a country. Bursa filled with builders, a mosque, a bath, a bazaar, a soup kitchen for the poor and the traveling, that grave, practical Ottoman charity that would follow the flag for 6 centuries, so that every conquest smelled, within a year or two, of baking bread. The first silver coins were struck with Orhan's name on them, which is how a chieftain tells the world he has become a sovereign. The Byzantines, absorbed in their own civil wars, treated the new Beylik as a useful neighbor. They hired its horsemen for their family quarrels, and a Byzantine emperor gave Orhan his daughter in marriage. Princess Theodora sailed across the strait to a frontier wedding. Nothing announces the future so plainly, and no one at the wedding could hear it. Everyone thought they were managing a border. They were feeding a tree. Look once more at the frontier before we leave it, because the story is about to cross a border of its own, and this warm hill country is the last of the world before. The camp has become a town. The town has a treasury and a wall and a Friday sermon in the bey's own name. The band has become a small army, still mostly horsemen but learning other trades. The neighboring beyliks, those dozen sibling principalities budded off the old sultanate, are being absorbed one by one until the house of Osman stands alone along the whole northwestern rim, holding the hills and the roads and, most importantly of all, holding the shore. For across a narrow ribbon of blue-black water, close enough at dusk that its watchfires seem to answer yours, lies Europe, the Byzantine province of Thrace, and behind it the tangled, quarrelsome Balkans, and behind them, unimaginably, everything else. The dream's wind, you remember, blew all the leaves one way. The water is only half a mile wide at the narrows. But that crossing belongs to the next chapter, and to the rising of the story's one real storm, and we do not take it tonight without first resting on this side of the water. So stay here a last moment on the eastern shore, in the pause the story itself took. It is evening again, the story's favorite hour. Behind you the hills roll back toward Bursa and its silver dome, lamp after lamp coming on in the towns that were Greek within living memory and are learning new songs without entirely forgetting the old ones. The strait below whispers against its stones. Somewhere in camp a horse sighs, somewhere farther a night bird calls once and is answered. The young state gathered on this shore does not know it is standing at one of history's great thresholds. No one ever knows that at the time, and so its sleep tonight is easy, and yours can be too. Let the image settle and dim now, as the fire settles, a small strong country on an old shore, a narrow water, a far line of hills going blue-black under the first stars, and the crescent moon standing over the strait like a mark on a page. Remember this place. We will go on from here. Whatever rises in the next chapter, and something does rise, you can feel it, distantly, like weather beyond the mountains. None of it rises tonight, and none of it rises toward you. You are the guest in this story, as Osman was a guest in the old sheikh's house, and the same courtesy covers you, a safe bed, a quiet dark, and whatever dreams arrive, arriving kindly. Rest now. Now the light changes. Not all at once, the way it changes before real weather, the gold going out of the air degree by degree, the wind arriving in advance of its clouds, the far hills sharpening under a sky the color of slate and pearl. Over the narrow water, Thrace lies under exactly that kind of sky on the evening the story crosses. The chronicles tell it like a raid out of an old song, a handful of Orhan's men, 80, some say, or 40, numbers in such tales are always poetry. Crossing the strait by night on rafts of lashed logs, scaling in the dark a fortress half ruined by a recent earthquake, and taking it before its garrison had properly woken. A toehold no more, a broken castle on a European shore. But it was the year 1354, and the house of Osman was now standing on both banks of the water, and it would not leave Europe again for 5.5 centuries. Feel the story's pulse quicken 1 degree, only one, like a sleeper's heart in a vivid dream. You are still perfectly safe. It is only weather, and it is far away. What poured across the strait in the years that followed was not, mostly an army. It was a settlement, a movement of peoples, with the army as its cutting edge. Turkmen herders drove their flocks onto the plains of Thrace. Dervishes built their lodges at the crossroads and made them into villages. The roads filled with the same patient traffic of grain and wool and salt that had followed the house of Osman everywhere. Edirne, old Roman Adrianople, the second city of the Byzantine north, passed into Ottoman hands within a decade and became, in time, the new forward capital. A startling thing, when you rest on it, an Asian frontier dynasty keeping its court in Europe, 150 miles west of Constantinople, which now lay not ahead of the tide but behind it, encircled, a great old lamp burning inside a closing hand. The Byzantines made what terms they could. There were treaties, marriages, tributes, all the sad, dignified paperwork of a shrinking world. The tide did not hate the city it was surrounding. Tides hate nothing, it simply rose. And as it rose it built, because this tide's peculiar genius was for institutions, for turning storm energy into standing structure, the way a coast turns surf into sand. Rest on the strangest and most famous of those structures a moment, for it is essential to everything that follows. The Janissaries, the new soldiers. The sultans had learned early that tribal horsemen, splendid in a raid, dissolve when you need a garrison or a siege line. What they wanted was a standing force that belonged to no tribe, no family, no faction, only to the throne. They made one, by a method history still turns over uneasily in its hands. The Devshirm, the levy of boys from the empire's own Christian villages, taken young, converted, schooled, drilled, paid, and raised into the most disciplined infantry the world then held, and into governors and engineers and grand viziers besides. Some of those villages mourned, and some, in the hard arithmetic of the age, saw a poor boy's one road to a palace. Both things were true. The night can hold them both. What matters for the story is this: while other realms rented their wars to feudal levies, this one now owned a spine of steel that never went home for the harvest. The tide's third sultan of this rising age took it to its first terrifying height, and he moved so fast the age nicknamed him for lightning. Bayezid, Urim, the thunderbolt, struck west and east in alternating seasons like a storm system that would not blow itself out, down into Greece, up to the Danube, back across all Anatolia, gathering the sibling Beyliks whole. When the alarmed kings of Europe finally raised a great crusade against him, French chivalry, Burgundian princes, Hungarian columns, the flower of the West, he met it at Nicopolis on the Danube in 1396 and broke it in an afternoon. Constantinople he simply blockaded for years on end, building a throttling castle on the Bosphorus shore, waiting for the great lamp to gutter. It seemed, by the century's turn, that the dream tree was already full grown, that the wind in its leaves was blowing the world's leaves down. The story rises here to its first false summit. Watch it from your warm distance the way you watch lightning on a horizon too far for thunder. All light, no sound, no danger to you at all. Then, in a single day, the whole thing nearly ended. Out of the farthest east came an older, vaster storm. Timur, iron conqueror of half the world, with an army that darkened the plateau. And at Ancora, in the summer of 1402, the thunderbolt's own storm broke against it and failed. The vassal Beyliks deserted him on the field. The unbeatable army came apart, and Bayezid himself, this is the part the old historians could never tell without lowering their voices, was taken alive, the only Ottoman sultan ever captured in battle, and died within the year, a prisoner in the conqueror's train. Timur rode over Anatolia, reinstated the little Beyliks, and rode away east to die on the road to China, and behind him the young empire lay in pieces, its heartland shattered, its princes at each other's throats. In Constantinople, you may imagine, the bells rang. The closing hand had sprung open. The tide, for the first time in 100 years, ran visibly out. Let the story rest there a breath, in the ebb, in the broken year, because what happens next is the quietest and most telling wonder of the whole rise. By every rule of the age, the Ottoman state should now have vanished. Steppe empires assembled at one man's speed usually scattered at the same speed, and here were 4 sons of a captive sultan warring over splinters. Instead, over 10 patient years of fraternal war, the interregnum, the histories call it, and we will keep its battles far off stage, the thing knitted itself back together, and the reason it could is everything this chapter has been quietly laying down. The tribes had scattered, but the institutions held. The janissaries still mustered and were paid. The judges still kept their registers. The towns still baked and taxed and traded under whichever prince held them. The Timar horsemen still owed their seasons to the throne, whoever sat on it. The dynasty had built a state that could survive the loss of its own head, the rarest talent an empire can have, and the one this empire would display again and again down all its long centuries. Storms fell it, the root held, the tree regrew. And notice, settling a little deeper into your pillow, how strangely comforting that worst chapter is. The catastrophe came, the full catastrophe, the leader lost, the army broken, the map erased, and the world did not end. The roads reopened within a season, because roads always do. The caravanserais relit their fires. The villages brought in a harvest that same autumn, Mongol horses or no Mongol horses, because the wheat does not follow the news. Ruin, seen from the distance we keep tonight, is almost never the end of a story. It is usually a hard winter inside a long life, remembered afterward mostly for what regrew. If some season of your own has lately felt like Ancora, scattered, leaderless, undone, let this old empire whisper you its one secret across 600 years. Keep the registers, keep the roads, keep the bread ovens warm, and the spring will find the root alive. The prince who won the long fraternal winter, Mehmed I, and the son who followed him, Murad II, spent the next 40 years doing exactly that. The great regathering, all of it patient, most of it quiet. The splinter beyliks came back in, a second time, more gently than the first. The Balkans were resecured with treaties as often as with sieges. One more Western crusade came down the Danube and broke at Varna, and after it the land war in Europe went still for a generation. And Murad himself, a sultan the chronicles remember as grave, musical, tired of the throne, did a thing almost without precedent in the history of power. He abdicated, twice, retiring to Manisa to sit with dervishes and poets, handing the empire to his boy of 12, and twice duty dragged him back when crises rose to meet the child. Rest on that image, far from the battlefields. An emperor who wanted, more than conquest, an early evening and quiet music, folding his cloak and stepping down into a garden. The empire's fiercest century, and at the heart of it, that. The boy he twice handed the throne to, and twice took it back from, is the one the next chapter belongs to. Mehmed, the second of that name, a silent, watchful, multilingual prince, Turkish, Greek, Slavic, Persian, some said Latin, who filled his notebooks with sketches of fortifications and with one city's name written over and over. The humiliation of being enthroned as a child settled in him not as rage, but as patience, which is far more formidable. When his father died and he rode to Edirne to take the throne for the third and final time, in 1451, the ambassadors reported home, almost with relief, that the new sultan was a bookish 19-year-old, mild in audience, eager to renew every treaty. Every treaty was renewed, and on the Bosphorus shore, that same spring, his engineers began pacing out the ground for a fortress across the narrowest of the water, opposite the one his great-grandfather had built. The old city on the promontory watched the walls rise and understood. So the chapter closes the way storm seasons close, with the air pressure changing and every bird gone quiet. 150 years have passed since the campfire on the Bithynian hillside. 4 long sultanates, 1 lightning strike, 1 shattering, 1 slow regathering. And the tide that began as a trickle around Byzantine walls now stands at the full, gathered, patient, engineered, waiting on one 19-year-old's word outside the last unfallen city of the ancient world. Whatever you feel gathering at the edge of the dark, remember what it is. A story, an old one, its outcome 5.5 centuries settled, its dust long since gone to gardens. You are not inside those walls, nor outside them. You are here, in your own held peace, watching history's weather from the one place it can never rain. Let the gathering stillness be your stillness. Rest now. Come then, to the city itself. In the last spring it would ever be Byzantium, and come to it gently from the sea, the way travelers had come to it for 1,000 years. It stands on its triangle of land where 2 seas meet, the Marmara on one side, the long sheltered inlet called the Golden Horn on the other, and the third side, the only side an army can approach, closed off by the most famous fortification on earth, the Theodosian land walls, 4 miles of moat and outer wall and inner wall, towers every 50 paces, built 1,000 years before and never once broken by assault. Behind them the city lies in its old age like a great house grown too large for its family, whole districts gone to orchards and ruins, the population shrunk to a fraction of its ancient million, but the great dome of Hagia Sophia still floating above everything, lamp-lit, serene, the largest enclosed space in the world for 1,000 years running. 53 days are coming which the city will spend holding its breath, and we will keep every one of them at the distance of a held breath. Walls, water, smoke, and bells. Nothing in this chapter will come close to you. It is the story's one great storm, and you are watching it from the far side of 5 centuries, wrapped warm. The artillery was the new thing under the sun, the reason this siege would end differently from all the sieges before it. Rest your mind's eye on the strangest image of the 15th century, the Great Bombard. A Hungarian founder named Urban had offered his craft first, the story says, to the emperor, who had no money, then to the sultan, who had a great deal. In a foundry at Edirne, Urban cast for him a bronze monster longer than 3 tall men laid end to end, throwing a stone ball weighing more than half a ton. It took 60 oxen and hundreds of men to drag it the 140 miles to the city, roads leveled and bridges strengthened ahead of it, moving a few miles a day, slower than a funeral, louder than thunder when it finally spoke. It could fire only a handful of times each day, and it cracked, and was recast, and cracked again, but each time it spoke, a 1,000-year-old wall shook. The age of high stone walls, the age that had built every castle in the world, was ending on that road at the pace of oxen. Feel how slow it is, even now, at the story's peak, history arriving at a walking pace, announced for weeks. And breathe, slowly, before the guns began, because inside the walls, in those last weeks, the city was doing quiet, human things, and they are worth keeping beside everything that follows. The Emperor Constantine, 11th of that name, last of a line that ran back to Augustus, walked the walls daily and begged help from a Europe that sent sympathy, promises, and a few hundred fighting men. Genoese and Venetians who happened to be in harbor stayed, most of them, and manned the towers beside Greeks with whom their churches had quarreled for centuries. Perhaps 7,000 defenders all told for 4 miles of wall, 1 man for every few paces, against an army the chroniclers counted in the many tens of thousands, camped in a crescent of tents and smoke from sea to sea. The defender strung the famous chain across the mouth of the Golden Horn, each link as long as a man's arm, closing the inner harbor to the Sultan's new fleet. Then they lit the lamps in Hagia Sophia and waited. The city had waited out 22 sieges before. Waiting was the thing it knew. The bombardment, when it came, went on for 6 weeks, the longest sustained artillery barrage the world had yet heard, and we will hear it as the villagers of Thrace heard it, as a slow irregular thunder over the horizon, arriving through the ground as much as the air. Stones fell, towers slumped, and every night the defenders came out and stopped the breaches with rubble and timber and earth, so that each morning the guns began their work again on yesterday's mending. Assaults rose against the patched places and broke against them, and the moat filled and was cleared, and the weeks passed. In the harbor the chain held. A small relief convoy fought its way in under sail, to bells and weeping. Hope and exhaustion took turns on the walls as they do. Hold all of it at the horizon, in that far gray gold stormlight. There are people in this story, and the night asks us to be gentle with all of them. The boy gunners deaf beside their bronze monsters, the Greek grandmothers passing baskets of earth along the wall by torchlight, the emperor asleep in his armor, the sultan asleep over his maps. All of them are 500 years past all harm now. All of their nights, hard as they were, ended. Then came the sultan's stroke of imagination, the one detail even drowsy history never forgets. Balked by the chain, he took his ships overland. Across the high ground behind Galata, his engineers laid a road of greased timbers, and over a single night and day, teams of oxen and men hauled some 70 galleys up out of the Bosphorus. Over the ridge and down the far slope into the Golden Horn, sails set as they went, the chroniclers say, oars moving in the air, drummers beating time, a fleet underway upon dry land. The defenders woke to find enemy ships riding the forbidden water inside the chain, and 4 miles of new shoreline suddenly needing men they did not have. It is warfare, and it undid them, and yet, held up to the lamp at this distance, it is almost pure dream image. Ships crossing a hill in the dark, the impossible done at walking pace by patient animals. Some nights, this story says, the world changes not with a roar, but with grease and timber and 10,000 quiet footsteps. Let the image float, galleys among the trees, under a clouded crescent moon, and let it carry you a fathom deeper towards sleep. The end, when it came before dawn on the 29th of May, 1453, and the story will keep its promise and stay at the distance of bells. In the last hours of the 28th, the two sides did the same thing. They gathered and they sang. Inside, the icons were carried around the walls in procession, and Greeks and Latins who had quarreled for 400 years crowded together into Hagia Sophia for one last shared evening liturgy under the Great Dome. Outside, the camp blazed with festival fires, and the night filled with prayer. Then, in the darkest hour, the final assault rolled against the mended breaches in wave after wave, and the guns spoke all together. And somewhere in the smoke the last emperor of the Romans threw off his purple and vanished, fighting into the crowd of the falling city, never certainly seen again, no body, no grave, only a legend the Greeks kept afterward of a marble king asleep beneath the city, waiting. By full morning the flags over the towers had changed. 1,000 years, and then, on an ordinary Tuesday in May, the next 1,000 years began. Breathe out slowly, and let the smoke thin and drift off the water, because history's mornings after are quieter than its nights, and this one turned quiet with astonishing speed. The young conqueror rode in through the gate at midday. Fatih now, the conqueror, 21 years old, and went straight to Hagia Sophia, and there, the chronicles say, he stopped a soldier who was prying up the marble floor, telling him the buildings belonged to the Sultan now, and walking the echoing galleries of the imperial palace, he murmured an old Persian couplet about the spider keeping the watch in the palace of the Caesars, and the owl calling the hours. Grief and triumph in one mouth, let both be true, as both usually are. The great church became a mosque that Friday, its mosaics not smashed but veiled, sleeping under whitewash and plaster, gold eyes closed for centuries, waiting. The city's sack was halted. Its people, scattered and ransomed, began to be gathered back. The lamp had not gone out. It had changed hands and changed names, and someone was already trimming the wick. For here is the turn this chapter has been carrying towards you all along, the one that lets its thunder settle into rest. The conqueror did not break the city. He married it. Mehmed took the Roman title among his own, Kaiser I Rum, Caesar of Rome, and set about rebuilding Constantinople as the capital of his own empire, with the energy of a man restoring an ancestral house. Populations were invited and resettled from all over the empire, Greek and Turkish, Armenian and Jewish, craftsman and merchant, each community under its own laws and clergy in the arrangement the empire would keep for centuries. The Greek Orthodox Patriarchate, extinguished in the fighting, was deliberately refounded by the Sultan himself, who invested the new patriarch with his staff in the old imperial manner. Aqueducts were mended, bazaars founded, the Grand Bazaar's first vaults raised, a new palace begun on the old Acropolis point where it still stands. Within a generation, the tired city of 50,000 was a roaring capital of 250,000, the largest city in Europe once again. Byzantium had not ended exactly. It had been grafted, root to root, onto the young tree, and the tree, from that spring on, grew with the strength of both. So leave the city on the evening of its first new spring, from the water again, the way we came. The smoke is long gone, the swallows are back over the Golden Horn, and the fishing boats are out, because fishing boats are always out, whatever flag flies over the towers. On the point above the meeting of waters, torches move where a young emperor is pacing out his palace gardens. Under the great dome, the evening prayers called for the first few hundred times of the millions to come. And the sound moves across the water at dusk the way it will move across it every evening of the next 5 centuries. like a slow bell, while under the plaster the gold mosaics sleep their long, safe sleep. One story has folded itself away, another has pulled the same roof over its head. The city, which has seen everything now, settles against its sea walls like an old cat by a fire. It was always good at waiting. It can wait for morning. And so can you. Rest now. Let 2 generations turn past now, quickly and quietly, like pages under a reader's thumb, the conqueror's son consolidating, his grandson doubling the empire eastward in a single reign. Syria and Egypt and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina coming under the crescent, the sultans becoming protectors of the pilgrimage and caliphs of Islam, and come to rest in the year 1520, on the morning the story's noon begins. A new sultan is girding on the sword of Osman at the tomb across the Golden Horn, a tall, grave, gray-eyed young man of 25 named Suleiman. The empire he inherits already runs from the Danube to the Nile. The treasury is full, the roads are safe, the shipyards are the largest on earth. Europe, which has learned to study each new sultan the way farmers study a sky, reports hopefully that this one is said to be a lamb after his father's lion. The lamb will reign for 46 years, longer than any sultan before or after, and the world will come to call him the Magnificent. His own people, with their surer instinct for what actually matters, will call him something better, Kanuni, the lawgiver. Hold both names. The whole chapter lives in the space between them. The magnificent part came first, and it came like sunrise, fast, golden, and impossible to look away from. Belgrade, the Iron Gate of Hungary, fell in his first year. Rhodes, the island fortress that had defied his great-grandfather, in his second. At Mohat in 1526, the Hungarian kingdom itself broke in an afternoon, and the tide stood on the middle Danube. His fleets, under the great admiral of the West, called Barbarossa, made the sea their own from Gibraltar to the Nile Delta. His caravans owned the land from the Persian frontier to the Atlas. Foreign ambassadors, jostling for audience in the new palace, wrote home in a kind of dazzled despair. One power now curved around Christendom from Budapest to Algiers like a drawn bow, they said, and at the center of it sat one calm man in white silk, who spoke little, listened long, and wrote poetry at night under a pen name that meant the lover. It is the high noon of the story, and like all noons it holds still while it lasts. Bask in it a moment, drowsily, without envy or alarm, as one basks in the warmth of a fire built long ago by strangers. But it is the other name, lawgiver, that made the noon worth remembering, and it is a far better name to fall asleep on. What Suleiman spent his 46 years actually doing, most mornings, was not conquest but adjustment, the slow, unglamorous, deeply humane work of tuning an empire so that its parts did not grind each other to pieces. The mass of imperial regulation, taxes, land tenure, market rules, criminal penalties, was gathered, reconciled with religious law, pruned of a century's contradictions, and reissued as a single great code that would steer the empire for 300 years. Fines replaced many mutilations, peasants gained standing to sue their own governors, and one often enough that governors grew careful. The tax rolls were reserved so the burden matched the harvest. None of it makes a legend. All of it decides whether ordinary lives are livable. The empire's own historians, who watched many conquerors come and go, gave their highest word to this one, not for the size of his realm but for its order. Under Suleiman, they said, a woman with a basket of gold could walk from one end of the empire to the other and arrive unrobbed. It was not perfectly true, of course. It was the kind of thing an age says when it is, on the whole, safe. Now lift your eyes, because above the lamplit streets of that long piece a skyline was rising, the one the world still recognizes at a glance, and it was mostly the work of a single pair of hands. Sinan, born a Christian villager in Anatolia, taken in the boy levy, trained as a military engineer, bridge builder to the army, and then, from his 50th year to his 99th, chief architect of the empire, in which time he raised or restored, by his own accounting, well over 300 works, mosques, schools, baths, bridges, aqueducts, caravanserais, almshouse kitchens. He spent a century of genius on one problem, the same problem Hagia Sophia had set the world 1,000 years before: how to float a dome full of light over a single open room, so that a crowd of thousands stands under one unbroken sky of stone. Dome by dome he closed on it, the Zizadeh first, his apprenticeship he called it, then the Suleimaniye, crowning the capital's highest hill for his sultan, its 4 minarets like masts, its courtyard cool as a cistern, and at last, in old age, at Adirn, the Selimiye, wider than the ancient dome at last, light pouring through its 100 windows, of which he said, "This one is my masterwork." Let those domes rise in your mind's dusk, one after another, lamp-ringed, floating over their cities like moored moons, because they are still there, every one, holding their sky of stone over the evening crowds, 5 centuries of earthquakes shrugged off, the calmest things human hands have made. Inside the noon, too, there lived a woman the story must not pass over, because the empire's own storytellers never could. She came to the palace as a slave girl from the Ruthenian borderlands, red-haired, quick and laughing. Hurrem, the court named her, the cheerful one. Europe, mangling her origins, called her Roxolana. And the grave sultan who had every splendor on earth fell in love with her the way ordinary people do, completely, and for life. He broke 1.5 centuries of dynastic custom to free her and marry her. Sultans did not marry, and this one married for love, and when she died before him, he wrote her elegies under his pen name until his own death. Their letters survive, and they are not the letters of a monarch and a consort. They are the letters of 2 people who missed each other badly. The palace politics that swirled around her were real and sometimes dark, and the histories weigh them still. But at the heart of the most powerful court on earth, at its very noon, there was verifiably an old married couple writing each other poems. The night is glad of such facts. Keep that one. And the Sultan himself grew old inside the gold, which is the part of every noon the ballads skip and the night insists on. The friends of his youth died or were lost to him. Some, the histories say gravely, by his own hardest decrees, for the safety of the throne exacted its terrible household prices. And this reign paid them too. We named that shadow once, honestly, and let it pass, for the man carried it to his grave, and it is not ours to carry tonight. His beloved died, his favorite sons died. The poems under the pen name grew quieter and turned from love to time. In his last years, gout-ridden, 71 years old, he insisted on riding out once more at the head of the army, one more campaign up the long Hungarian road he had first ridden as a young man of dazzling fortune. He died in his tent outside a small fortress called Sigidvar, 2 days before it fell, and his Grand Vizier, needing the army steady, kept the death secret for weeks, signing orders in the dead man's name while the columns marched home, so that the empire's longest reign ended the way a great bell ends, the strike long past, the hum going on, and no one able to say to the second when the sound became silence. Breathe out, and let that bell hum carry the chapter toward its rest, because the empire it hummed across was at its absolute height, and the height, seen from the night's distance, is a strangely tender place. 30 million people, 3 continents, the sea from Gibraltar to the Crimea, more Christians under the Sultan's peace than under the Pope's, a postal relay that outran every rider in Europe, an architecture at its summit, a poetry at its summit, a legal order humming in 500 courts. Nothing about it was eternal, and nothing about it was fragile either. It was simply, for that stretch of decades, the largest lamplit room on earth. The travelers who saw it never forgot it. The peoples who lived it argued about it for centuries after, as peoples argue about any old house they shared, and the skyline it raised against the dusk is still the first thing every traveler photographs, leaning on the same ferry rails at the same hour of lamps. Notice, though, drowsily, without any alarm, the small stillness that has entered the story, because this is where the long shape of the night begins to turn. The tide is no longer audibly rising. Vienna was reached in this reign, and not taken. The Persian frontier fought to a treaty line that would barely move again. The fleets met their limits in the Western Sea. Nothing has fallen, nothing will truly fall for centuries, but the empire has, without knowing the moment, finished becoming larger and begun instead to become itself. Historians mark the turn generations later with dates and battles. Lived from inside, it felt like nothing at all. Like the moment in mid-afternoon when the light, without dimming, changes angle, and the garden goes from growing toward the sun to simply standing in it. That is where we leave the golden age, not ending, standing, fully grown, fully lit, at the top of its long day, with the long, beautiful, lamplit afternoon still entirely ahead of it. So let the noon settle over the whole map one last time before the chapter dims, the domes floating above their cities, the courts recording their small justices, the caravans counting their bells across the plateau where our story began, past the old caravanserais, past Bursa and its silver dome, past a certain hillside in Bithynia, where nobody any longer remembered which slope it was that a minor chieftain once slept on and dreamed of a tree. The tree itself was now the size of the sky. And like all full-grown trees on long afternoons, it had entered the time of its life when growing gives way to shading, when the point of all that height and reach is simply the shelter underneath it. The markets in its shade, the courts in its shade, the 30 peoples and their lamps and their suppers and their sleeping children, all in its shade. Stay under it as the light goes amber. The loud centuries are over. Everything from here descends, gently, garden by garden, toward rest. Rest now. Every tide, however great, leaves a line on the sand, a last dark thread of weed and driftwood at the very top of the beach, marking the place the water touched once and did not touch again. This chapter is about that line. It is not a chapter of defeats. The empire in these decades remained the strongest single power in its world, and would remain so for a long lifetime yet. It is a chapter about edges, about the years in which the tide, still full, still heavy, still capable of terrible reach, began to discover the shape of its own shore. The discovery happened quietly, as such discoveries do, at the far ends of long roads, in the autumn rains outside Vienna, on a burning sea at Lepanto, on an island fortress that would not yield. No single morning announced it. But when the histories look back, they can see the waterline plainly, drawn across the middle of the 16th century like a tide mark across sand. Watch it drawn now, from your great warm distance, while the light in the story turns from noon gold to the first deep amber of afternoon. Begin at Vienna, in the September of 1529, at the absolute farthest reach of the westward road. Suleiman had come up the Danube in the spring with the largest army Europe had seen in centuries, meaning to settle the Hungarian question and knock upon the Habsburg door. But the rains that year were the kind the old chronicles crossed themselves over, weeks of them, roads gone to marsh, rivers over their banks, and the great guns, the siege-winning guns, abandoned one by one in the mud of 1,000 miles. What arrived before the walls of Vienna in late September was an army already looking over its shoulder at winter. 3 weeks the siege lasted, gallant and half-hearted at once. The mines fired, the assaults broke, the first snows dusted the tents, and then, in the middle of October, the horsetail standards turned for home, 1,500 cold miles of home, because that is the tyranny no conqueror escapes, the campaigning season, the arithmetic of oats and daylight. Vienna never forgot its deliverance. The empire barely recorded a check. But there it is on the sand if you look, the first thread of weed at the top of the beach. Distance itself had entered the war on the other side. Breathe slowly, and feel, with a certain drowsy sympathy, the shape of the problem, because it is a strangely restful thing to understand. Empires of that age were creatures of the marching season. An army wintered at the capital, walked out in April when the grass could feed the horses, and had to be home or housed by November. From Constantinople, the roads ran outward like spokes, and by the 1530s, the spokes had grown so long that the rim of the wheel lay months away from the hub. To reach Vienna took half the season, to besiege it, the other half, to hold anything beyond it, more seasons than the year possessed. The empire was not weakening. The empire was simply, at last, the size of its own reach, the way a tree is the height of its own sap. The lands within the Great Wheel settled into 3 centuries of Ottoman peace. The lands beyond it settled into being neighbors. Geometry in the end is how most wars stop. At sea, the same lesson arrived through salt and fire, and it took 2 famous stages to arrive. The first was Malta, in 1565, the small bare island of the Knights, last splinter of the crusading age, where an Ottoman armada landed in high confidence in the spring and wrecked itself all summer against one fortress of pale stone. The Great Siege of Malta became legend in the West. From the story's distance to night, it is something simpler and sadder and almost domestic. Thousands of brave men on both sides, spending a summer proving that the age of taking everything was ending, one assault at a time, under a sun that did not care. The armada sailed home in September, and the Western Sea kept its gate, and the sea itself set about smoothing its own surface, as the sea always does, erasing the summer by October as though water could not remember, or chose not to. The second stage was Lepanto, 6 years later, the last great battle ever fought between fleets of rowing ships, and one of the loudest afternoons of the entire century. In the Gulf off western Greece, the combined galleys of Spain, Venice, and the papacy met the imperial fleet line against line, some 500 ships in all, a floating city of masts, and by evening the Ottoman line was broken and burning, and Europe rang its bells for a year. And now watch what the night finds most interesting, which is what happened next. Almost nothing. Within a single winter, the shipyards of the Golden Horn, the largest on earth, remember, had built a new fleet, hull for hull. Within 2 years, Venice, exhausted, signed the peace and paid an indemnity. Cyprus, the island the war had been about, stayed Ottoman for 3 centuries. The Grand Vizier of the day put it with magnificent, sleepy arrogance to the Venetian ambassador. In taking Cyprus, he said, "We have cut off one of your arms. In burning our fleet, you have merely shaved our beard. The arm will not grow back, the beard grows thicker." He was right, and yet the tide mark is there too, dark on the sand. The empire's navy never again sought the great decisive battle. The sea, like the land, had found its line. And let the guns fall silent there, truly silent, for they are the last broadsides this episode will sound at close range, and feel what the silence is made of. It is not the silence of ruin. Nothing has been ruined. The empire that emerges from these decades still holds everything that matters to it. The Danube, the Nile, the holy cities, the world's crossroads, the world's greatest capital. It has merely stopped being a tide and become a sea, settled into its own vast basin, level, deep and calm, its storms internal and occasional, its shores agreed. The frontier fortresses settle into garrison routine, generations of soldiers growing old in them without ever seeing a campaign. It is, if you let it be, a deeply sleepy stretch of time, and it was lived by millions of people about whom the chronicles say nothing at all, which is history's way of saying they were mostly at peace. Rest inside that peace a moment in one of its 10,000 unrecorded evenings. A garrison town on the middle Danube, let us say, in the 1580s. The fortress gate is shut, the river slides by, wide and brown and patient. Storks stand in the shallows below the walls. In the lanes, Hungarian and Turkish and Serbian and German blur together over the price of hay. The muezzin calls from the minaret that was a church tower and will one day be a church tower again. The border does that to buildings, gently, more than once, and nobody in the lane looks up from the hay. Somewhere a Habsburg spy and an Ottoman spy are drinking at the same inn, possibly at the same table, filing reports that say, in 2 languages, "All quiet on the border this month. All quiet on the border this month." 4 centuries later, you can still feel how good it is, that sentence. Let it be filed on your behalf tonight. All quiet. Inside the Great Wheel, meanwhile, the Empire's deeper life went on thickening, and this is where the chapter's true turning quietly lives. With the frontiers resting, the Empire's energy turned inward and downward, into the fabric. These are the decades when the classical Ottoman world settles into the shape it will hold for centuries, the provincial law books refined, the pious foundations multiplying until half the shops in the empire paid their rent to a school or a soup kitchen or a fountain, the great age of the coffeehouse arriving, that revolutionary institution we will sit down in properly 2 chapters from now, and with it a whole new civilization of the evening. What the grumbling chroniclers of the day were actually describing, without the vocabulary for it, was an empire beginning, only beginning, to change its question, from how far to how well. That change of question is the real final turning of tonight's story, and no battle marks it. Of course, the histories give these same decades another famous label, the beginning of the long decline, and since the phrase will hover over the rest of our night, let us take it out once, look at it drowsily, and put it where it belongs. It is true that after Suleiman the sultans, on average, ruled less and reigned more, that palace factions and janissary politics grew tangled, that the silver flooding in from Spanish America unsettled prices here as it unsettled them everywhere on earth, that the world's trade had begun, drop by drop, to find the ocean routes around Africa, thinning the caravan gold. All true, and all. This is the part to keep, astonishingly slow. This decline is measured in centuries. A power that declines for 250 years and still requires the combined attention of every other empire on earth is doing something more interesting than declining. It is enduring. We will watch the ebb honestly in the chapters ahead, because it happened. But we will watch it the way the night watches everything, without dread. A tide going out is not a catastrophe. It is half of what tides do, and the beach it uncovers is full of things the flood hid. So close this chapter standing on the tide line itself, in the amber light, with the whole beach laid out below you. Behind, up the sand, the marks of the flood, Bursa, the strait, the fallen walls of Constantinople, the noon of Suleiman. All of it keeps, all of it holds, all of it is the empire's forever. Ahead, down the slope of the centuries, the long bright wet expanse the ebb will slowly uncover, not empty, never empty, strewn with cities and songs and gardens, with the entire inward civilization the empire built when it stopped building outward. The water is level now, poised at the full, the way the sea goes strangely still at the turn. Stand in that stillness, nothing is wrong in it, nothing is ending in it. It is only the largest breath of the story being let out, slowly as an empire can exhale, over the next 250 years. Let your own breath join it, out, and easy. The turning is done, everything after it is homeward. Rest now. The last great reach came in the summer of 1683, and the story will honor it the way one honors an old soldier's final parade, fully, briefly, and with the gentleness of known outcome. Up the Danube road once more, 154 years after the first attempt, the largest army the empire had fielded in a century, the horsetail standards, the sacred banner, the whole engine tightened one last time by the iron viziers of the House of Koprulu, and entrusted now to a grand vizier whose ambition outran his siegecraft. For 2 months that July and August, Vienna held its breath behind walls the first siege had taught it to rebuild. The mines crept forward, the counterscarp fell, the city grew gaunt, and then, on a single September morning, help came down out of the Vienna woods like weather off a mountain. The winged horsemen of Poland King Sobieski at their head, the largest cavalry charge in the memory of Europe, and by nightfall the great camp with its silks and its coffee sacks and its abandoned standards belonged to the rescuers, and the road home had begun. It was the high water mark, exact and final. The tide touched the top of the beach that morning and turned. What followed the turning was 16 hard years the story will take at a merciful distance. The long war of retreat down through Hungary, fortress by fortress, until at last, at a town called Karlowitz in 1699, something happened that was in its quiet way more historic than any siege. The empire sat down at a table as one power among several, and negotiated and signed. It had never done that before, not in 3.5 centuries. It had dictated or granted, but never bargained as an equal. Hungary was ceded, borders were drawn with instruments rather than armies, and the chroniclers wrote it down with a shaking hand as humiliation. Read tonight, by lamplight, it looks like something else as well. A very large, very proud, very tired house deciding, at last, to live on a street with neighbors, to trade the exhausting sovereignty of the open sea for the ordinary, durable, survivable dignity of a border. Empires that never learned that signing die young. This one learned it at 350, and lived 200 more. And breathe out now fully, because the story does exactly this at exactly this point. It exhales and turns its back on the frontier and goes indoors. And what it finds indoors is one of the loveliest surprises in the whole 600 years. The generation after Karlowitz did not spend itself on revenge. It spent itself, to the lasting astonishment of historians, on tulips. The reign of Ahmet III, in the early 1700s, is remembered in Turkish as the Lale Devri, the tulip era, a dozen years in which the whole culture of the capital turned, as if by common consent, toward pleasure of the gentlest kinds: gardens, fountains, poetry, porcelain, conversation, and above all the flower itself, bred into hundreds of named varieties, traded at fabulous prices. Celebrated each April in illuminated night festivals where tortoises with candles fixed to their shells wandered the flower beds of the palace, moving the lights slowly among the stems while the court watched from carpets and the poets competed in verses about the moon. Hold that image. It may be the most perfectly sleep-shaped image the 18th century produced. Candlelight, moving at tortoise pace through 10,000 dark tulips under a crescent moon. It was not an escape, it was a policy, an understanding that, drowsily, makes the era even sweeter. The Grand Vizier of those years, Ibrahim of Nebachir, was a man of peace by conviction, and around the gardens he assembled the empire's first deliberate season of catching up. The first Ottoman printing press, licensed in 1727, its first books rolling off into a court that debated them furiously over coffee. Embassies sent to Paris and Vienna, not to demand but to observe. New libraries endowed, whose reading rooms still opened their shutters every morning in Istanbul. The little summer palaces going up along the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn, all lattice-work and fountains, built for the pleasure of sitting still by moving water. The empire, which had spent 4 centuries asking how far, was teaching itself with real diligence to ask how well, the question the Tideline chapter promised, arriving now in person, dressed in silk, carrying a coffee tray and a book. Let the era's own favorite hour settle around you. A summer evening on the sweet waters, the meadow streams at the head of the Golden Horn, in about 1725. Caiques, the slim lacquered rowing boats of the city, drift home along the darkening water, cushions and murmurs, a lantern at each stern doubling itself below. On the meadows, families fold their carpets as the first stars come. Somewhere a ney flute practices the same soft phrase over and over, unhurried, like a bird settling. The smell is cut grass, rosewater, wood smoke, and the sea. A fountain, one of the little roofed marble fountains this era scattered through the city like signatures, each carved with a verse about water and eternity, ticks and glitters at the landing stage. Grand history has, for the moment, nothing to say. It kept no minutes of this meeting. It only left the fountains, dozens of them, still ticking in the lanes of Istanbul 300 years later, each one a small marble memorandum that reads, "We were here, the water was sweet, the evening was long." The tulip era ended, as gentle seasons in absolute states end, abruptly and unfairly, a war gone sour, a city mob, a bonfire of the pleasure palaces, the peaceable vizier's life the price of the peace he had kept too long. The story notes it with the sigh it deserves and declines tonight to dwell there, because the deeper current the tulip years had started did not stop. It never stopped again. For the rest of the empire's long life, a century and 3/4 still to run, the pattern set in those gardens repeated in slow pulses. Reach outward to learn, draw inward to digest, a reforming sultan, a conservative reaction, then a deeper reform, printing, then engineering schools, then new model regiments, each pulse burrowing further into the fabric. The empire of the long afternoon was not asleep. That is the caricature its rivals drew, and we will not copy it. It was doing something harder than conquest, something that has no parades. It was renovating an ancient house, room by room, while 300 million neighbors watched through the windows and the family argued on every landing. Renovation is slow. It was meant to be slow. Old houses that are gutted fast fall down. In the coffee house that will get its full chapter soon, the 18th century invented, almost without noticing, the empire's evening voice, the storyteller's voice, which is, at this hour, our own. The meta with his staff and his kerchief, doing every character in a tale of Nasreddin the wise fool. The shadow play screen with Karagöz and Hacivat bickering in silhouette. The lamp behind the linen throwing their quarrels 10 feet tall. An empire that had once spoken to history in the voice of canon now mostly spoke, evening by evening, in this voice, ironic, patient, melancholy, and kind, the voice of a very old civilization that has seen everything twice and forgiven most of it. When people say the Ottomans declined, it is worth remembering what they actually did with those centuries. They talked. They told stories in the dark until the dark was friendly. Any listener drifting toward sleep tonight is, in the most literal way, sitting in that same lamplight, in the same shade, hearing the descendant of that same voice. Once, in the middle of the century, the afternoon produced its perfect emblem, and the story sets it here like a paperweight on all these loose leaves of years. In 1755, the Bosphorus froze, a thing seen perhaps twice in a century, and the people of Istanbul, who had fought and buried and rebuilt and endured on that water for 300 Ottoman years, poured out of both continents onto the ice and walked across the strait to visit each other. Vendors dragged braziers out onto the frozen sea and sold hot salib to crowds strolling between Europe and Asia. Children slid where the war galleys had rowed. For a week or two, the empire's great dividing water was a village green. Then the thaw came, and the ferries resumed, and history went back to keeping its solemn minutes. But hold that picture a moment against everything the word empire usually means. No walls, no standards, no tide. Just 30 peoples in their winter coats, walking on water, buying each other warm drinks, under the low sun of a very long afternoon. That too is what 600 years were made of. Mostly that, in fact. The afternoon had its true weather as well, and the night will not pretend otherwise. New wars came in the century's second half, and this time the hard arithmetic ran the other way, a rising Russia to the north. Borders that now moved inward decade by decade, the Crimea lost in 1783, the first territory of the Muslim heartland ever ceded, and at the century's very end, a young French general landing in Egypt to announce with cannon that the world's fast era had begun, and would not wait. Ahead, in the 1800s, lay the wrenching decades of real reform. New armies, new laws, new schools, new debts, and beyond them the ending we already know is coming, because we placed our Ember beside these ruins at the start of the night. The house would not stand forever, but it is 140 years yet from falling, and tonight we are under no obligation to hurry toward any of it. The night's remaining chapters have somewhere better to go first, deeper into the bazaar at evening, into the city of cities itself, into everything the long afternoon was for. So let the chapter end where the era itself loved best to end a day. In a garden by the water, at dusk, in the lamplight the whole night has been descending toward. The fountains tick. The tulips stand closed and dark in their beds, keeping tomorrow folded inside them. Across the strait, the lamps of the other continent come out, near enough at dusk, as they were at the story's beginning, that the watchfires seem to answer one another. Only now they are not watchfires at all, merely windows, suppers, arguments, cradles, books. The great tree of the dream has long since stopped growing, and its shade has never been deeper. Under it, an entire civilization is doing what you are doing, settling, hushing, banking its fires, trusting the dark. The tide is out there somewhere, ebbing at its imperceptible ebb, and it can be left to history's care until morning. Gardens by lamplight, and the long dusk beginning, and time at last, after 4 centuries of marching, moving at the pace of a candled tortoise among the flowers. Let it carry you. Rest now. Here the story does what it promised, and steps off the timeline altogether. No more dates for a while, no more tides. For the rest of the night we are inside the empire, not above it, down at the level where 600 years were actually lived, one evening at a time. And the truest way in is through the door every traveler used, the bazaar. Every account of the empire that outsiders ever wrote home, Venetian merchants, French ambassadors, wandering scholars, sooner or later gives up on the politics and simply describes the market, because the market was the thing itself, the whole idea of the empire, laid out on counters. So imagine yourself arriving as they arrived at dusk, through one of the gates of the covered bazaar of Istanbul, out of the last daylight and into a warm amber world of vaulted stone, where the lamps are being lit one by one down lanes that run further than you can see. Let the door's heavy curtain fall behind you. The evening bell that closes the gates is still an hour away. There is time. There was always time here. The covered bazaar was begun in the very first years after the conquest, the young sultan ordering a bedesin, a stone strong room of trade, before his new capital had finished changing its name. And then it simply grew, century over century, the way coral grows, lane joining lane, vault joining vault, until it became a roofed city inside the city, 60 streets and more under one continuous ceiling, thousands of shops, wells and fountains and small mosques of its own, a population of merchants who spent whole lifetimes under that stone sky and knew its weather. The cool of its mornings, the gold dust of its afternoons when sunlight fell through the high grilled windows in slow solid beams. Each trade kept its own street, after the old custom, the goldsmiths together, the carpetmen together, the slipper makers, the book dealers, the sellers of quilts. Together, because togetherness kept the prices honest and the gossip good. A man shopping for a silver bridle walked one lane and heard one music. A woman choosing silk thread walked another. You could navigate it blind, they said, by smell alone. Leather, then rose oil, then paper, then wool. Walk one of those lanes slowly now, and let the inventory of an empire drift past you in the lamplight. Silk from Bursa, the first Ottoman capital, where the mulberry orchards fed the looms for 500 years. Angora wool, soft as breath, from the high dry plateau. Carpets down from the Anatolian towns, each village weaving its own remembered pattern, prayer-sized to palace-sized, stacked in soft cliffs taller than a man. Brass and copper out of the smith's quarter, beaten into trays and ewers and coffee pots, every surface worked over with vines. Spices up from Egypt by the great yearly convoy, sharing their lane with dyes from India and porcelain carried overland from China itself. Every object in the bazaar had crossed the frontier to be there, most had crossed several, and none of it was remarkable to anyone but you. That was the quiet boast of the place. The crossroads of the world did not need to say so. It only needed to open in the morning. Breathe slowly now, and feel the deeper machinery under all that abundance, because it is a restful machinery to understand. None of it moved by chance. Out beyond the city, the caravan roads ran to the horizons in every direction, and along them, a day's walk apart, always a day's walk apart, measured by the pace of a loaded camel, stood the great stone khans, the caravanserais, part inn, part fortress, part warehouse, endowed by sultans and viziers as works of charity. A merchant and his animals could shelter 3 days at any of them without payment. That was the rule, and it held from the Balkans to Baghdad. Picture the evening ritual repeated 10,000 times across 4 centuries. The caravan filing in through the single gate at dusk, the great court filling with the sigh of unloading camels, the smell of dung smoke and stew, the murmured news of the road rising with the wood smoke into the first stars. Then the gate barred for the night, and everyone inside it safe, man, beast, and bale. An empire is many things, but on most evenings, for most of its people, it was this: a gate that closed at dusk and held. And who is inside the gate? Everyone. That is the fact about this empire that takes the longest to truly picture, and the one most worth carrying towards sleep. In the bazaar lanes and the Han courtyards you would hear, in a single hour, Turkish and Greek and Armenian and Arabic, Slavic dialects from the Balkan provinces, Persian, the language of poetry, Kurdish from the eastern mountains, Ladino, the Spanish of Jews welcomed into the empire by the boatload after Spain expelled them in 1492, carrying their keys and their language with them, and keeping both for 5 centuries. The empire sorted its peoples not by blood, but by faith, each community, Orthodox, Armenian, Jewish, and the Muslim majority, running its own schools and courts and weddings under its own leaders, paying its taxes, keeping its lanes. Within a few streets, you could pass a mosque, a church, and a synagogue, each with its lamps lit, each with its own evening sounds, sharing the same cats and the same water and the same wall against the wind. It was not a modern idea of equality. No one should pretend it was. But it was a working piece, durable, ordinary, unremarked, and it lasted, in the world's most contested city, longer than most nations have existed. The proof of that peace was never written in the law books. It was written in smaller places, in the way holidays leaned on each other, Easter bread and Ramadan drums and Purim sweets circulating through the same courtyards in their seasons, neighbors keeping half an eye on one another's calendars, because a feast next door meant trays passed over the fence. In the guilds, where craftsmen of every faith worked the same trade under the same rules, marched together in the great processions, and paid into the same box for each other's funerals. In the food, which stopped belonging to any one in particular a century in, the stuffed vegetables, the flaking pastries, the grilled fish, the syrup-soaked sweets, all of it traveling from kitchen to kitchen until the whole empire ate, more or less, the same supper and argued only about whose grandmother made it best. Historians debate empires in terms of armies and taxes. The bazaar suggests a different measure. How many languages can stand in one lane at dusk, buying dinner from each other? Here the answer, on the ordinary evening, was all of them. Now find a bench, because in the middle of the 16th century, something arrived in these lanes that changed the empire's evenings forever, and it arrived in a sack. Coffee. The berry had been discovered in the highlands of Yemen, brewed first by mystics who wanted to stay awake for midnight prayers, and shipped north through the Red Sea port of Mocha, a town that would lend its name to the drink in a dozen languages. It reached Istanbul in the 1550s, and within a generation it had conquered the capital more completely than any army ever conquered anything. The roasting pans, the little long-handled pots, the tiny cups without handles, the grounds read afterward for fortunes. And with the drink came the institution, the coffee house, and with the coffee house came something the world had not quite had before: a warm, lit, public room where any man could sit for hours, for the price of a cup, and talk. The coffee houses spread through the empire like lamplight spreading down a street, hundreds in the capital within decades, then thousands, then one in every village big enough to argue in. They were called, half in jest and half not, the schools of the wise. The chessboards and backgammon boards clacked on their low tables. The storytellers held court on their benches. Poets tried new verses on merciless audiences. News walked in from the harbor and went out embellished. Authority was never entirely comfortable with them. Twice, briefly, sultans banned coffee outright, worried about the talk, and twice the talk won. The ban would fade, the shutters would reopen, the smell of roasting would drift back through the lanes like a homing bird, and the empire settled permanently into its evening shape. The mosque for the soul, the bazaar for the purse, the coffee house for everything else. It is not too much to say that from Istanbul, the coffee house conquered the world. Venice first, then Vienna, then London and Paris, so that every warm murmuring cafe on earth tonight, every late-night refuge with small tables and slow time, is a distant colony of those benches. The empire's most enduring conquest turned out to be a place to sit. Let yourself settle deeper into that bench, and take the hour the coffee house was actually for. The lamps are trimmed, the steam rises from the little cups in slow ribbons. Someone has fed the brazier, and the copper glows. At the far end, the storyteller is deep in a tale of Nasreddin, the wise fool of the whole Near East, and the room's attention leans toward him the way plants lean toward a window. Beside you, two gray merchants play backgammon with the speed of long marriage, barely looking at the board. The talk around you is quiet and various. Freight rates, a betrothal, the pilgrimage roads, whether the north wind will hold. Nobody in this room is making history. Nobody in this room wants to. That is the luxury the long afternoon of the empire bought, evening by evening, for millions upon millions of its people across 3 centuries, the luxury of an unrecorded night in warm company. Sit in it a while. It was always meant to be shared. The bell rings at last, the deep old bell that means the bazaar gates are closing, and the whole roof city begins its nightly settling, shutters sliding home down lane after lane. Locks turning, the day's coals banked in 1,000 braziers, the merchants calling their unhurried good nights in their several languages as they walk out through the gates toward supper. Behind them the vaulted dark closes over everything, over the carpets and the copper, the silks and the spice, and the night watchmen begin their slow rounds with their lanterns, and the bazaar cats, sleek and innumerable and employed since the beginning of time, take charge of the lanes till morning. Moonlight comes down through the high-grilled windows and lies on the stone floor in pale diamonds. It is, and was for 500 years, one of the quietest places on earth between midnight and dawn, a treasure house asleep, breathing leather and rose oil and coffee, keeping the whole world's goods safe under one roof until the lamps are lit again. Leave it so. Walk out under the last arch with the merchants, into the cool of the evening. The city of cities is waiting for you, next, in the dusk. Rest now. Every empire has a heart, and this empire's heart was never in doubt. It was the city that older maps simply called the city, because for 1,000 years of Greek and 500 of Turkish, no one on 3 continents needed to ask which one. Byzantium, Constantinople, Istanbul. 3 names, 1 place, no erasures. Each name laid over the last the way silt lays over silt in a slow river. Everything kept. Tonight, with the empire's whole story now behind us and only its quiet left, take the gentlest tour the night can offer. One long walk through that city at dusk, across all its centuries at once. This is a walk without dates. The city does not keep time the way chronicles do. It keeps everything simultaneously. A Roman wall holding up an Ottoman house holding up a drying line of laundry. And to walk it at evening is to walk through 600 years, and 1,500 more beneath them in the space of a mile. Put your hand on the first stone, and begin. Begin at the land walls, out at the city's western edge, where the story's loudest chapter happened, and where the quiet is now deepest of all. The great triple walls still run their 4 miles from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, breached once in 1,000 years, and then, by the conquerors, carefully repaired. Empires keep good walls, whoever built them. By this hour, they are a garden. Fig trees root in the arrow slits, vegetable plots green the old moat, tended by families whose right to the ground is older than anyone's paperwork. The tremendous towers stand up out of the allotments into the last light, like old men standing among grandchildren. And this is the first lesson the city teaches on an evening walk, the lesson the whole walk will repeat. Nothing here was ever wholly lost. It was inherited. The city is a palimpsest, a manuscript written over, again and again, with no page ever quite scraped clean. And dusk is when all the old writing shows through. Walk inward, down the long spine of the old city, and come to the building that carries more layers than any roof on earth, the great Church of Holy Wisdom, Hagia Sophia, 1,000 years a cathedral, then, from the morning after the conquest, a mosque, its dome uninterrupted through both lives. Stand under that dome at dusk as 20 generations of the astonished have stood, a ceiling like a held breath, so wide and so high that the first historians swore it must be hung from heaven on a chain. Golden mosaics glimmer up in the vaults from the church centuries. Immense round calligraphy medallions float below them from the mosque centuries. 4 minarets stand outside like tall patient lamps around an old fire. The conquerors did not tear the sanctuary down. They knelt in it, they shored its foundations, and their finest architects studied it their whole lives the way musicians study a master. Whatever one believes or does not, the building at evening makes a single argument in one enormous quiet voice. That reverence outlives every particular empire that houses it. The lamps come on, a low warm ring of them under all that height, and the dome above dissolves into shadow, and you could be in any of 15 centuries at once. You are. Breathe slowly, and drift from there along the ridge to the palace on the point, Topkap, house of the sultans for 400 years, and notice, first, what it is not. It is not a colossus, no marble cliff, no mile of mirrors. Europe's envoys, primed for thunder, were often quietly baffled by it. It is instead a garden with rooms, courtyard opening into courtyard, pavilions scattered among plane trees and fountains, tiled kiosks built for single pleasures, one for watching the moon rise over the water, one for the first tulips, one for listening to rain. The empire that could build anything chose, at its very center, to build shade and the sound of water. By this hour the great plane trees, some of them 700 years old, propped and hollow and still leafing every spring, are full of roosting doves and the last of the light. The peacocks have gone silent along the walls. From the point beneath the farthest pavilion comes the low conversation of the 3 wilders meeting, Marmara, Bosphorus, Golden Horn, which was the true throne room all along. Sit on the worn marble a moment, where the Sultan sat when the petitions were done. The view is unchanged, lamplight beginning on 2 continents, and the water carrying it. Go down now to the Golden Horn itself, the calm deep inlet that curls through the city like a question mark, and take the hour when it earns its name, dusk, when the low sun comes up the water, and the whole inlet holds the light like a struck bell holds sound. This was the empire's harbor and the world's, the shipyards along the northern shore that could float a fleet in the winter, the customs quays where the grain of the Black Sea and the oil of the Aegean and the spice of Egypt all came ashore. Now at evening, the caiques thread home across the bright water, slim lacquered boats, a lantern at each stern doubling itself below, and the ferries cross and recross with their small thunder, gulls unspooling behind them, and the 7 hills of the old city stand up from their own reflections, domes and minarets and cypresses printed upside down in gold. Fishermen line the bridge rails shoulder to shoulder, in no hurry, catching mostly the sunset. Lean on the rail among them. The water under you has carried emperors, armadas, and refugees, and this evening it carries mackerel and lamplight, and it makes no distinction, and never has. Then comes the moment the whole city turns toward, the one every traveler tried and failed to fit into a letter home, the evening call to prayer at dusk, moving across the water. It begins from one minaret, a single voice, high and slow and freighted with 1,500 years, and then another answers from the next hill, and another across the Horn, and another faint from the far Asian shore, until the dusk itself seems layered with slow overlapping song, the way the sea is layered with swells from different storms. The gulls rise and turn in it. The ferries idle their engines mid-crossing, or seem to. In the Greek quarters the church bells wait their turn, as they have learned to across 5 centuries of sharing the same air, and in the old lanes the shopkeepers pause with their shutters half lowered, not all of them praying, all of them listening. It lasts a few minutes only. Then it fades the way it came, voice by voice, hill by hill, and the city exhales into evening proper. Lamps, supper smoke, the clink of glasses on cafe tables. If a civilization can be held in one sound, it is this one. Many voices, given turns across water, at dusk, ending in quiet. Cross with the last ferry to the Asian side, to Iskandar of the old songs, and feel the particular gentleness of the city's other shore. Here the pace was always half a step slower. The wooden houses leaned together over lanes going down to the water, their upper stories jettied out on carved brackets so that neighbors could pass the news, and the pot of beans across the gap without descending. Their bay windows are latticed for privacy and cushioned for the chief occupation of the shore, which is watching the strait. And above the lanes, on the hillsides, stand the cypress groves, the great dark spires of the old cemeteries, which this city, unusually among the world cities, never feared. Families picnicked among the stones on holidays. The paths through them were shortcuts and promenades. The turban headstones lean at their sociable angles like guests late at a long dinner. The dead were neighbors here, not exiles, installed on the best hills, under the best trees, with the best views of the water, still part of the household of the city. It is a very restful thing when a place is at peace with its own sleeping. This one always was. It kept its sleepers close and kept the lamps lit around them. The city has its own old art, the art of being ancient and comfortable at once, and it needed that art because its history asked hard things of it, and the walk should say so once, gently. It burned many times, whole quarters of those wooden houses going up in a night, the fire towers watching for smoke by day and lantern flare by dark. It shook when the old faults under the Marmara turned in their sleep. It knew plague years and siege years and, at the very end of our story, occupation years. And after every one of them it did the same simple, enormous thing. It rebuilt on top of itself, keeping the line of the lanes, reusing the fallen stone, planting the fig trees back in the new wall's crevices, adding one more layer to the manuscript, scraping nothing. That is why the evening walk feels the way it feels. You are not walking through a preserved city, embalmed and roped off. You are walking through a surviving one, scarred, layered, loud by day, alive all the way down, and at dusk, when the light goes level and golden, all its ages surface at once like carp rising in a pond. The empire fell, when it finally fell, softly here. The city barely broke stride. Cities of this kind do not end. They accumulate. Now let the walk end where every evening in this city ends, at the water, with the lamps. Find any low place on either shore, a tea garden under a plane tree, a ferry landing, a flat rock the fishermen have polished for centuries, and simply sit and watch the city bank its fires. The domes go from gold to gray to silhouette. The minarets keep the last light longest, then let it go. The windows come out on both continents, thousands upon thousands, and lie down in long trembling columns on the black water between. A late ferry crosses, lit like a drifting lantern, and its wake unrolls towards you for a full slow minute before it arrives as the smallest conceivable waves, patting the stone below your feet, unhurried, regular, older than every empire whose name the water has forgotten. The moon, a crescent of course. It was always a crescent here, on the standards and the domes and the water, stands up out of Asia and lays one more silver path across the strait. The city of cities murmurs behind you, settling, layer upon layer upon layer, all of it held, all of it kept. You can sleep in a city like this. Everyone always could. That was the point of it. Rest now. There is a kind of house you may know. Every old waterfront has one. A grand wooden mansion from another century, weathered silver gray, its boathouse empty, its garden gone kindly to seed, one window lit at dusk. Passers-by call it faded, and are not wrong. But step closer on a quiet evening, and the truth is gentler and more interesting. The lamps still work, the great cool rooms still smell of cedar and salt. Somebody is still cooking supper in the deep old kitchen, and the house, which has outlasted every architect and owner and fashion that made it, is not dying in the least. It is settling, the way all long-lived wooden things settle, easing its joints by fractions of inches per decade, finding its final comfortable relationship with the ground. That house is this chapter. The last 2 centuries of the empire are almost always told as a medical chart, a long decline, a sickbed. Tonight, off the timeline, in the hush of the story's late hours, we will tell them the other way, from inside the house at dusk, with the lamps on, because that is where the truth of a long old age actually lives. Begin with what actually changed, because it was never, first, a matter of armies. The world's wealth changed its roads. For all the centuries of the story so far, the roads of trade between Asia and Europe ran through the empire's rooms, up the Red Sea, across the caravan country, into the bazaars we walked at dusk, and the empire lived, as every crossroads lives, on the tolls and the passage and the endless profitable stopping. Then, slowly, over generations, not years, the ocean routes around Africa, and later the sea lanes to the Americas, drew the great streams of commerce out of the old channels. No one lost a battle. Nothing burned. The caravans still walked, the Hans still opened their gates at dusk. There was simply, decade by decade, a little less passing through. The tolls thinner, the warehouses emptier at the margins, the world's center of gravity leaning, imperceptibly and then unmistakably, out to sea and away. The house did not crumble. The road outside it grew quieter. Much of what the chronicles call decline was only that, the sound of traffic receding. Breathe slowly, and let the second change settle beside the first. The institutions grew old, in the way institutions do, which is to say comfortably. The Janissaries, once the wonder and terror of Europe, the empire's iron new soldiery, had become over 3 centuries a vast hereditary guild, married, shopkeeping, drawing pay, defending nothing so fiercely as their own arrangements. The provincial cavalry lists filled with names that never mustered. The palace ceremonies grew longer as the campaigns grew shorter. It is easy to make this sound like rot, and the reforming sultan certainly said so at volume. But hold it a moment in the evening light and it has another face. An institution that relaxes is an institution no longer being asked to die regularly. The empire's machinery softened because, for long stretches of these centuries, the terrible pressures that had forged it were off. Soldiers became grocers because the border was quiet and grocery was wanted. The fierce lean state of the conquest years became a stout old establishment full of pensions and precedents, inefficient, familiar, humane in its fashion, less like a sword, more like a very large family firm in its 4th century, run from a desk drawer nobody had sorted in living memory. And then, because the world outside was speeding up and would not wait, the house began, carefully, argumentatively, room by room, to renovate. The 19th century is the great age of Ottoman reform, and the story will take it as the era took its own evenings, gently, and without the committee minutes. New model schools, where geometry and French sat beside the old learning, a medical academy, a war college, newspapers, first official and stiff, then unofficial and lively. The fez replacing the turban in the offices of state, a small thing that redrew every street scene in the empire within a generation. Steam ferries on the Bosphorus, whistling their punctual astonishment past the rowing kayaks. The telegraph, running out along the old caravan roads on its poles, so that for the first time in the empire's life, the capital could ask a question of Baghdad and be answered before the season changed. Railways, feeling their way inland from the ports, their timetables printed in 3 alphabets. Gas lamps down the grand new avenues. The empire's last century is so often told as a falling that its truer daily texture gets lost. It was, for the people living in it, an age of arrivals. Every year something new came up the road. The renovations went deeper than machinery, and the deepest of them deserves one quiet paragraph of its own. In the middle of the century, the empire's statesmen, the frock-coated, French-speaking, endlessly memoranda-writing generation known as the men of the Tanzimat, the reordering, set out to do something no empire of its age and size had quite attempted, to transform subjects into citizens. Decrees went out declaring the life, honor, and property of every person in the empire secure regardless of faith. The old distinctions were, on paper and sometimes off it, leveled. Mixed courts were founded. Provincial councils seated Muslim and Christian and Jew at the same green baize tables. It was incomplete, contested, uneven. Reform in an old house always is. The wiring argues with the beams. But hold the intention up to the lamp because it shines. An ancient, sprawling, sacred monarchy, under no compulsion but the century itself, sat down and tried to rebuild its own foundations with the family still living in every room. Historians still argue over how much of it held. The Knight simply notes that the house chose renovation over ruin, every time it was given the choice, for its whole last 100 years. Meanwhile, Europe, watching all this through the windows, settled on its famous diagnosis, the sick man of Europe, and the phrase stuck so hard that it deserves to be answered here, softly, once. It was coined at a moment of crisis and repeated for 70 years, mostly by neighbors composing their condolences early, some of them measuring the sick room for furniture. But consider what the sick man did across those 70 years. Held together a realm of 30 peoples on 3 continents, while newer, healthier empires lost provinces and dynasties and heads. Produced statesmen its rivals negotiated with warily, and poets its own people still recite. Rebuilt its army twice, its law codes twice, its schools 3 times, and outlived nearly every doctor who signed the certificate. The empire in its last century was not a patient failing to recover. It was an old proprietor renegotiating, from a weakening hand, with extraordinary tenacity and no small dignity, the terms on which a very large family would go on living in a very old house on the world's most coveted corner. That it managed this for 100 years, the concert of Europe circling, the creditors at the door, is not a decline to pity. It is a performance to respect. Rest a moment inside the era's own favorite room, because the 19th century built one, and it is one of the most peaceful rooms in the whole story. The Yali, the waterside mansion, and its world along the Bosphorus. The straight shores in these decades grew a fringe of these long wooden houses, painted oxblood and cream, their foundations in the water itself, their latticed upper rooms hanging out over the current, so that sleep there was sleep inside the sound of the sea. Life in them moved at the pace of the water, coffee at the seaward windows in the morning, the ferry's wake arriving as a slow silver ruffle minutes after the ferry had gone, visits paid by rowing boat from landing to landing, in the evenings, music, the old modal songs, and now also a piano, imported, slightly out of tune from the damp playing waltzes to the fishing lights. The empire's grandees built these houses as retreats from history, and the houses obliged so thoroughly that history itself now remembers the whole era half by their light. Lamplit windows doubled in black water, the silhouette of the far shore, the small talk of tides against old wood. When this chapter says the old house settles, it is this house, literally, that it sees. Settled on its posts in the moving water, creaking amiably, lit from within, lasting. And so come back, at the end, to the house at dusk, because now every detail of it reads true. The garden gone sweetly wild, that is the old provincial order, overgrown but still bearing fruit. The new copper wiring stapled with mixed success along the ancient beams, the reforms, humming, occasionally sparking. The proud faded rooms kept for guests who visit mostly to appraise, the embassies of the concert of Europe, received with perfect courtesy and watched with clear eyes. The deep kitchen where the household of 30 people still, on the ordinary evening, eats the same supper and argues about whose grandmother made it best. And the one lit window on the water, which is the whole point. The house is inhabited. 6 centuries in, thinner and grayer and encircled by a century that has decided its verdict in advance, the empire is still, every single dusk, a place where lamps are lit, someone trimming the wick, someone drawing the curtain, someone banking the kitchen fire for morning. Ahead, and soon now, comes the last chapter of the house, and the story will not flinch from it. But it will arrive the way this ending actually arrived, not as a burning, as an evening. The house settling the final inch. The lamps carried, one by one, up to bed. Let the chapter close on the water it has been listening to all along. Night, full night now on the Bosphorus, the yellow windows lying in gold columns on the black current, a late steam ferry hooting somewhere down toward the city, unhurried, homeward. The old house stands where it has always stood, settled at last, cleared down onto its bones, nothing left in it strained or provisional, everything come to rest exactly where the years wanted it. Somewhere inside, the last lamp but one goes out. The water keeps up its small talk against the posts, the same syllables it has said since before Osman dreamed his tree, and will say after every story told tonight has been forgotten and retold and forgotten again. Old age, the night observes, is not the opposite of greatness. It is the proof of it. Nothing settles that did not first stand for a very long time. Let your own weight go now, the way the house lets go, joint by joint, fraction by fraction, trusting the ground. The ground holds. It held 600 years. Rest now. Every long story earns its ending, and the mark of a story told with love is that the ending arrives with quiet instead of noise. This chapter is the ending. 600 years, arriving at their last few evenings, and before it begins, the night makes you its promise. The storm will stay outside the window. In the early years of the 20th century, the old world's last and greatest storm broke over every empire alive, the war the survivors simply called the Great War. And the old house was pulled into it, and it suffered what all the houses of that generation suffered, and none of that suffering will be paraded past you tonight. The night keeps it the way the city keeps its hardest years, acknowledged, honored, and left in the closed rooms where it lives. What this chapter watches, from a great warm distance, is only what the story owes, how the longest lived of the great empires actually ended, which was not with a sack, not with a burning, not as its founders or its enemies ever imagined, but with signatures, and a gray morning, and a ship, and a quiet that even the historians, who agree on so little, agree was almost eerie in its gentleness. When the storm passed and the skies cleared, in the years just after the war, the world looked at the old Crossroads and found everything changed. The empire's Arab provinces had gone their ways under new flags and new mandates. The capital itself lay under the guns of foreign fleets, occupied, its old order suspended between an exhausted palace and an uncertain future. And out on the Anatolian plateau, the same high dusk gold plateau where the whole story began, 6 centuries and 11 chapters ago, a new struggle and a new assembly had risen, led by the empire's own last great generation of soldiers, to decide what would live in the old land next. The story of those years is stirring and hard and belongs to another night. What matters to this one is the shape of what emerged, not chaos, but a decision. The people of the old heartland, asked by history what they wished to keep, chose the land, the language, the future, a republic, compact and new, with its capital out on the plateau itself, in Ankara, where the caravans once rested. And that left, standing in the empty palace by the water, one last question, 600 years old. What to do about the house of Osman? Breathe slowly and consider that house one final time before the answer comes, because there was never anything like it and will likely never be again. One family, in one unbroken male line, from Osman of the dream to the man now waiting by the Bosphorus, 36 sultans across 6 centuries, conquerors and poets, lawgivers and recluses, magnificent and unlucky and everything between, an unbroken thread through the fall of Constantinople and the noon of Suleiman, through tulip festivals and Tanzimat decrees, through every chapter of tonight. Rome's lines broke and broke again. China's mandates passed from family to family. Europe's thrones traded dynasties like weather. The Ottomans were, from first Ember to last, one house. Whatever else the centuries took, that thread held. So when the National Assembly in Ankara, in the first November of the peace, separated the crown from the country, abolishing the sultanate, thanking the dynasty into history, it was not deposing a king. It was pensioning off the oldest working institution in the political world, the way a family, with averted eyes and steady hands, at last retires the grandfather's chair from the head of the table. The last sultan left on a gray November morning, and the manner of his going is the whole chapter in miniature. No abdication scene, he never signed one. No mob at the gates, the city barely knew. Before dawn, a small party left the palace by a side entrance. The old man, his young son, a physician, a bandmaster, a handful of attendants in cases, and passed through the rain-wet garden to the shore, where a launch waited to carry them out to a British battleship standing in the strait. There is a detail the memoirs keep, and the night keeps it too, because it is perfect. As the launch pulled away, the old man is said to have looked back once at the long pale waterfront of the palace. The lattices, the empty boathouse, the windows where 6 centuries of his family had watched this same water, and said nothing at all. The ship weighed anchor quietly and stood away down the Marmara for Malta. On the shore, the lamps of the city were still burning in the early gray. 600 years of the sword of Osman left the story exactly as the story would have wished. By water, in silence, at dusk's other end, with the household asleep. There was one ember left, and history, which is not usually a poet, held it burning for 16 more months, as if unwilling to let the tale end on a battleship. The sultanate was gone, but the family's other, older dignity remained. The caliphate, the symbolic headship of a faith, and it passed to the last sultan's cousin, Abdul Masid, a man the palace centuries had shaped for exactly this coda. He was a painter. It is somehow essential that he was a painter, a gifted one, exhibited in Vienna. He painted the harem courtyards and the Bosphorus light and portraits of his family among their books. He composed a little, he read French philosophy, he kept in the empty palace a small court of music and pictures and conversation, a candle flame of the whole civilization at its gentlest, burning on the shore of a country that had already, respectfully, moved on. For 16 months the old house was headed not by a conqueror or a lawgiver, but by an artist at an easel by the water, the 600-year story pausing, before its last line, to paint one final picture of itself. Then, in the early spring of 1924, the new republic completed its architecture, and the assembly voted, and the last office of the House of Osman was folded away into history with the rest. He left, and the family with him, the whole remaining household of the dynasty, on a March night, by train, and again the details are so gentle they read like the night's own invention, though every one is recorded. The Orient Express was held for them at a small suburban station outside the city, to spare everyone the theater of the great terminal. The governor of the city came to see them off and was, the accounts agree, courteous. There was coffee from a station samovar in the cold. The painter caliph, wrapped in his overcoat on the platform, thanked the officials for their trouble. Somewhere past midnight the train drew out, west, along the shore of the Marmara, the water of the whole story, keeping pace outside the dark windows for a while, silvered by exactly the crescent moon you would ask for, and then the line bent inland, and the water fell away, and that was all. 36 sultans, one dream of a spreading tree, 600 years, concluded not with cannon at the walls but with a held train, a cup of station coffee, and an old painter watching the moonlit sea slide away behind the glass. The ember did not go out, the night insists on this. It was carried out, cupped in careful hands, still warm. And in the city and the old lands, the morning after, and this is the part the chapter has been keeping for you, the gentlest true thing in the whole long story, life simply continued. The ferries ran on time. The bazaar gates opened at the usual hour, the lanes filled, the cats resumed their posts. The call to prayer moved across the water at dusk exactly as before, and the church bells of the old quarters waited their turn as before. The Republic changed the letterhead and the alphabet in the capital, and set about its own young story with tremendous energy. But the deep city, the palimpsest city, barely rippled. No empire so large had ever left the room so quietly. Rome's ending echoed for 1,000 years of grief and imitation. Other empires went down in flame and reprisal. This one finished like a long evening finishes, the light changing so gradually that no one in the garden can say afterward when exactly the day ended, only that the lamps were on now, and the air was cooler, and it was time, and somehow nothing that mattered had been lost in the dark. The dome still stood, the fountain still ticked. Supper still smelled the same. What survived the way water survives a river's renaming. The republic that rose in the old house's place was built by the house's own children, its officers, its school teachers, its telegraph clerks. Every one of them formed in those renovated rooms of the last century. And it inherited, beneath all the new paint, the deep grammar of the old place, the layered city, the shared table, the fierce hospitality, the coffee in its small cup, the habit of living comfortably on top of one's own history. And the family itself, scattered politely across the capitals of Europe, aged into its exile with the character the palace centuries had bred. There were no pretenders' armies, no plots worth the name. There were memoirs and music lessons, and in the painter's case, canvases of a Bosphorus he never saw again, painted from memory in the south of France, the light in them still, by every account, exactly right. Decades later, the Republic, grown secure, quietly let the descendants visit. They came as tourists and stood in the courtyards their name had built, among the other visitors, unrecognized, and by most accounts they liked it that way. The tree of Osman's dream did not fall. It became the shade. So this is where the night sets down the ending, and you may hold it as you drift. An empty throne room by the water, in half dark. One oil lamp, burning low on a stand, the kind a caretaker leaves. Dust, drifting very slowly through a single beam of moonlight from the high lattice, each mote lit for a moment, then dark, then another. The great chamber does not grieve. Stone this old does not grieve. It simply keeps, the way the walls keep, the way the water keeps its syllables against the landing stairs outside. 600 years came through this room, and the room remembers all of it and insists on none of it. Somewhere far off in the sleeping building a door closes softly. A watchman's slow step passes and recedes. The lamp flame leans once, recovers, burns on, smaller now. It has been dimming all night, this flame. You have watched it dim through every chapter, from the campfire on the hillside to here, and it has never once gone out. It will not go out now. It is only doing what the whole story has been teaching you to do since the first breath of the evening, growing quieter and quieter and quieter still, without ever quite leaving. Let it teach you the last of it. Grow quiet with it. The house is asleep. The ending is over. Only the keeping remains. The story is over now. What is left is the walk home, the slowest, softest part of any evening, and the one question the night always asks last, with no urgency at all, the way a friend asks it at the door. What remains? 600 years is a long time for a lamp to burn. When a light that old finally lowers itself into the dark, it does not vanish, it disperses into the stones it warmed, the rooms it lit, the habits of everyone who ever read or cooked or fell asleep by it. So come, one last time, with no destination and nothing left to happen, and let the night show you where 6 centuries went. None of it is far away. That is the quiet astonishment of this particular empire. Its remains are not buried under desert sand or fenced off in silence. They are out in the open, in daily use, warm to the touch, being prayed in, drunk from, walked across, hummed, from the Danube to the Nile, this very evening, by millions who rarely think to ask where the shade over their street first came from. Begin with the skyline, because it is the signature the empire left on the sky itself. From Sarajevo to Cairo, from Skopje to Damascus, the old cities of 3 continents carry the same handwriting at dusk. The gray lead-covered domes, rising in families, the great one lifted on its shoulders of half-domes. The minarets, slender as reeds, holding the last light long after the streets below have gone to lamplight. The grandest of them still stand exactly where their architects watched them rise, the Mosque of Suleiman on its hill above the Golden Horn, serene as a mountain range. The Master Sinan's 100 other domes scattered across the old provinces like seals on a long correspondence. And in Edirne, his acknowledged masterpiece, finished in his 9th decade, its dome wider than the ancient one that had humbled his youth. Stone does not boast, and these stones have never needed to. They simply continue, earthquake after earthquake, century after century, doing at every dusk what they were raised to do, gathering the day's last gold, holding it a moment above the rooftops, and letting it go gently into the blue hour. Look up at them now from your pillow's distance. They are still holding it. Come down from the skyline into the courtyards, and find the empire's second signature, small enough to hold in 2 hands, the tile. Iznik, a lakeside town the story passed in its very first chapters, spent a century and a half making the most beautiful ceramic surfaces the world has produced. White grounds bright as fresh paper. A blue borrowed from heaven by way of China, turquoise, sage, and then, for one unrepeatable half-century, a red like the first coal of a fire, raised slightly from the glaze, whose exact secret died with its makers and has never, in 400 years of trying, been fully found again. The tiles were set by the tens of thousands into mosque walls and palace chambers, whole rooms turned to gardens that no winter could touch, tulips and carnations and blossoming plum, curling vines, drifts of blue clouds, so that to stand in them is to stand inside a spring morning that has lasted since Suleiman. Empires usually leave their portraits in marble faces and bronze horsemen. This one, forbidden the face, left flowers, acres of painted flowers, forever open, forever cool, and left them where the daily foot traffic of ordinary prayer would pass beneath them for centuries. Power fades, the tiles say, quietly, in blue. Gardens keep. Now let the smallest legacy of all find its way into your hands. Warm. The coffee. You sat in the coffee house 2 chapters ago. Feel now how far its lamplight reached. From those Istanbul benches, the little cups traveled into every language and every evening on earth. The word itself, kahve, carried west as cafe and coffee. The Viennese houses founded, the legend insists, on sacks abandoned outside the walls in 1683. The Parisian and London rooms where newspapers and insurance and revolutions were invented over the empire's drink, served in the empire's manner. And the ritual persists to this hour, unbroken in the old lands. The long-handled pot, the grounds fine as dust, the slow foam raised and never boiled, the tiny cup set down with a glass of water and a piece of Turkish delight, the fortune waiting in the saucer for anyone brave enough to turn it. Whole treaties of the old diplomacy were conducted at the pace that little cup enforces. Whole marriages, to this day, are proposed over it. If you would hold 600 years in your hand tonight, it is easiest like this. Something small, dark, sweet at the bottom, warm through the porcelain, meant to be finished slowly, in company, at dusk. Breathe slowly and listen, because some of what remains is carried on the air. The empire dissolved into sound as much as stone. Its music is still everywhere in the old lands, the long modal lines that refuse to hurry, the clarinet at the wedding, the lament and the dance grown from the same root. Europe's composers borrowed its marching percussion for their Turkish rondos, and the cymbals in every orchestra on earth are, to this evening, mostly made by a dynasty of Istanbul founders begun under the sultans 4 centuries ago. Its words are scattered through a dozen languages like seeds from a split pod. Yogurt and kiosk and sofa and divan, caviar and sherbet, kismet, the coffee already in your cup. Its stories move on their own feet still. Nasreddin the wise fool rides his backward donkey through the schoolbooks of 40 countries. Karagöz and Hagavad bicker behind lit screens at festivals. Grandmothers from the Balkans to the Gulf begin tales with the same formula the Medes used. Once there was, and once there wasn't. No border drawn since has managed to stop any of it. Songs and words and jokes are the one cargo that never paid a toll at anyone's frontier, and they are crossing tonight, all of them still. And everywhere, on tables from Bosnia to Alexandria, the longest supper in history goes on being served. The empire's kitchen was its parliament, the one chamber where all 30 peoples truly legislated together, amending each other's recipes for 600 years, and its acts are still in force. The stuffed vine leaves and the peppers, the slow braises, the flaking pastry sheets rolled thin as a bride's veil. The skewered grills of the garrisons, the milky puddings of the palace, the honeyed baklava whose true home a dozen nations still contest at holiday tables, and the contest itself is the inheritance, the old family argument continuing, which means the family, in the way that matters, continues too. A civilization can be measured by its ruins, its coins, its archives. It can also be measured like this. A century after the last sultan sailed, a stranger can travel the old empire's whole map, through a dozen alphabets, faiths, and flags, and be fed at every single stop, from the same remembered kitchen, and be pressed to a second helping in the same tone of unanswerable hospitality. The house of Osman closed. The house's table was never cleared. History, given its say, will keep its balances. 6 centuries hold their full human weight of conquest and grief alongside the fountains and the tiles, and the peoples of the old lands keep their own ledgers, each with its sorrows, and the night does not presume to settle any of them. It only reports at the end, the one finding every honest account returns to, that this empire, of all the great empires, is the one whose evenings were best. Its noons were like the other empire's noons, loud, armored, glittering, brief. But no one else made dusk an institution the way this civilization did. The lamps on the water, the coffee after the day's heat, the fountain's tick, the storyteller clearing his throat, the long shade of the plane tree with the whole town gathered in it, the gate that closed at nightfall and held 600 years, and the best of it was always the last hour of the light, which is perhaps why its story makes such a home for sleep, and why the night chose it for you tonight. You have not been listening to a history of power. You have been listening to the world's longest lesson in how to end a day. So let everything the night has carried settle now, softly, in its final order. The plateau at dusk, and the caravan road. The campfire on the hillside, and the dream of the tree whose shade outgrew its empire. The walls and the cannon, quiet now for centuries. The great bronze monster dozing in a museum garden where children touch its muzzle on school visits. The domes at noon, gone gray and eternal. The tide at its highest mark, and the long, bright ebb. The tulips closed in their dark beds, the frozen strait with its strolling crowds, the bazaar asleep under its stone sky, cats on watch. The old house settled on its bones above the water, one window lit. The held train, the station coffee, the painter, and the moonlit sea. And the lamp in the empty room, small and lower now, its beam of drifting dust thinning toward plain darkness. Every one of them is yours to keep, sleep will file them where it files all the best evenings. 600 years, laid down like a long day at last, and nothing left awake in any of it but the water against the stones, saying the same syllables it said before the beginning, and will say after every ending. Somewhere out there now, over the old crossroads, the crescent moon is standing above a skyline of domes, the way it stood over the first campfire and the last gray morning. And beneath it, a fallen column lies in the grass beside one small ember. Your ember, the one we placed together at the very start of the night, beside the ruins of an empire. It has burned all evening at the edge of the story, patient as everything else in this history, and it is doing now what embers do at the end of the long watch. Sinking into itself, going from gold to rose to the deep-held red of a heart at rest, giving up its light in exchange for warmth, and its warmth at last, in exchange for peace. There is nothing left to tend. The stars are thick above the old land, the water is speaking softly to the stones, the cities of the crossroads are asleep in their lairs, and every gate on the long roads is closed for the night and holds. Let your breathing find the water's pace. Let the last of the light go without following it. It knows the way. And so, the ember dims, but the story remains. And sleep.